Section 5 of A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. Chapter 4. Part 1. How Simon Carne Won the Derby. It was 7 o'clock on one of the brightest mornings of all that year. The scene was Waterloo Station, where the Earl of Amberley, Lord Orpington, and the Marquis of Laverstock were pacing up and down the main line departure platform, gazing anxiously about them. It was evident from the way they scrutinised every person who approached them that they were on the lookout for someone. This someone ultimately proved to be Simon Carne, who, when he appeared, greeted them with considerable cordiality, at the same time apologising for his lateness in joining them. "I think this must be our train," he said, pointing to the carriages drawn up beside the platform on which they stood. "At any rate, here is my man. By dint of study he has turned himself into a sort of walking Bradshaw, and he will certainly be able to inform us." The inimitable Belton deferentially insinuated that his master was right in his conjecture, and then led the way towards a Pullman car, which had been attached to the train for the convenience of Carne and his guests. They took their seats, and a few moments later the train moved slowly out of the station. Carne was in the best of spirits, and the fact that he was taking his friends down to the stables of his trainer, William Bent, in order that they might witness a trial of his candidate for the Derby, seemed to give him the greatest possible pleasure. On reaching Merford, the little wayside station nearest the village in which the training stables were situated, they discovered a comfortable four-wheeled conveyance, drawn up to receive them. The driver touched his hat, and stated that his master was awaiting them on the downs. This proved to be the case, for when they left the high road and turned onto the soft turf, they saw before them a string of thoroughbreds, and the trainer himself mounted upon his well-known white pony, Columbine. "Good morning, Bent," said Carne, as the latter rode up and lifted his hat to himself and friends. "You see we have kept our promise, and are here to witness the trial you said you had arranged for us." "I'm glad to see you, sir," Bent replied, "and I only hope that what I'm about to show you will prove of service to you. The horse is as fit as mortal hands can make him, and if he don't do his best for you next week, there will be one person surprised in England, and that one will be myself. As you know, sir, the only horse I dread is Vulcanite, and the fact cannot be denied that he's a real clinker." "Well," said Carne, "when we have seen our animal gallop, we shall know better how much trust we are to place in him. For my own part, I'm not afraid. Vulcanite, as you say, is a good horse, but if I'm not mistaken, Knight of Malta is a better. Surely this is he coming towards us." "That's him," said the trainer, with a fine disregard for grammar. "There's no mistaking him, is there? And now, if you'd care to stroll across, we'll see them saddle." The party accordingly descended from the carriage and walked across the turf to the spot where the four thoroughbreds were being divested of their sheets. They made a pretty group, but even the most inexperienced critic could scarcely have failed to pick out Knight of Malta as the best among them. He was a tall, shapely bay, with black points, a trifle light of flesh perhaps, but with clean, flat legs and low, greyhound-like thighs, sure evidence of the enormous propelling power he was known to possess. His head was perfection itself, though a wee bit too lop-eared if anything. Taken altogether, he looked what he was, thoroughbred every inch of him. The others of the party were Gasometer, Hydrogen, and Young Romeo, the last named being the particular trial horse of the party. It was a favourite boast of the trainer that the last named was so reliable in his habits, his condition, and his pace, that you would not be far wrong to set your watch by him. "By the way, Bent," said Carne as the boys were lifted into their saddles, "what weights are the horses carrying?" "Well, sir, Young Romeo carries 8 stone 9 pounds, Gasometer 7 stones 8 pounds, Hydrogen 7 stone 1 pound, and the Knight 9 stones 11 pounds. The distance will be the Epsom course, 1 mile and a half, and the best horse to win. Now, sir, if you're ready, we'll get to work." He turned to the lad who was to ride Hydrogen. "Once you're off, you'll make the running, and bring them along at your best pace to the dip, where Gasometer will, if possible, take it up. After that, I leave it to you other boys to make the best race of it you can. You, Blunt," calling up his head lad, "go down with them to the post, and get them off to as good a start as possible." The horses departed, and Simon Carne and his friends accompanied the trainer to a spot where they would see the finish to the best advantage. 5 minutes later an ejaculation from Lord Orpington told them that the horses had started. Each man accordingly clapped his glasses to his eyes, and watched the race before him. Faithful to his instructions, the lad on hydrogen came straight to the front, and led them a cracker until they descended into the slight dip which marked the end of the first half-mile. Then he retired to the rear, hopelessly done for, and Gasometer took up the running, with Knight of Malta close alongside him, and young Romeo only half a length away. As they passed the mile-post, young Romeo shot to the front, but it soon became evident that he had not come to stay. Good horse as he was, there was a better catching him hand over fist. The pace was all that could be desired, and when Knight of Malta swept past the group, winner of the trial by more than his own length, the congratulations Simon Carne received were as cordial as he could possibly desire. "What did I tell you, sir?" said Bent, with a smile of satisfaction upon his face. "You see what a good horse he is, there's no mistake about that." "Well, let us hope he will do as well a week hence," Carne replied simply, as he replaced his glasses in their case. "Amen to that," remarked Lord Orpington. "And now, gentlemen," said the trainer, "if you will allow me, I'll drive you over to my place to breakfast." They took their places in the carriage once more, and Bent having taken the reins, in a few moments they were bowling along the high road towards a neat modern residence standing on a slight eminence on the edge of the downs. This was the trainer's own place of abode, the stables containing his many precious charges lying 100 yards or so to the rear. They were received on the threshold by the trainer's wife, who welcomed them most heartily to Merford. The keen air of the downs had sharpened their appetites, and when they sat down to table, they found they were able to do full justice to the excellent fare provided for them. The meal at an end, they inspected the stables, once more carefully examining the Derby candidate, who seemed none the worse for his morning's exertion, and then Carne left his guests in the big yard to the enjoyment of their cigars, while he accompanied his trainer into the house for a few moments' chat. "And now sit down, sir," said Bent, when they reached his own sanctum, a cosy apartment, half sitting-room and half office, bearing upon its walls innumerable mementos of circumstances connected with the owner's lengthy turf experiences. "I hope you're satisfied with what you saw this morning?" "Perfectly satisfied," said Carne, "but I should like to hear exactly what you think about the race itself." "Well, sir, as you may imagine, I have been thinking a good deal about it lately, and this is the conclusion I have come to. If this were an ordinary year, I should say that we possess out and away the best horse in the race. But we must remember that this is not by any means an ordinary year. There's Vulcanite, who they tell me is in the very pink of condition, and who has beaten our horse each time they have met. There's the Mandarin, who won the 2000 this week, and who will be certain to come into greater favour as the time shortens. And the Filibuster, who won the biennial stakes at the Craven meeting, a nice enough horse, though I must say I don't fancy him over much myself." "I take it then that the only horse you really fear is Vulcanite?" "That's so, sir. If he were not in the list, I should feel as certain of seeing you leading your horse back a winner as any man could well be." On looking at his watch, Carne discovered that it was time for him to rejoin his friends, and be off to the railway station if they desired to catch the train which they had arranged should convey them back to town. So bidding the trainer and his wife good-bye, they took their places in the carriage once more, and were driven away. Arriving at Waterloo, they drove to Lord Orpington's club. "Do you know you're a very lucky fellow, Carne?" said the Earl of Amberley, as they stood on the steps of that institution afterwards, before separating in pursuit of the pleasures of the afternoon. "You have health, wealth, fame, good looks, one of the finest houses in London, and now one of the prospective winners of the Derby. In fact, you only want one thing to make your existence perfect." "And what is that?" asked Carne. "A wife," replied Lord Amberley. "I wonder the girls have let you escape so long." "I am not a marrying man," said Carne. "How could a fellow like myself, who is here today and gone tomorrow, expect any woman to link her lot with his? Do you remember our first meeting?" "Perfectly," replied Lord Amberley. "When I close my eyes I can see that beautiful marble palace set in its frame of blue water as plainly as if it were but yesterday I breakfasted with you there."
"That was a very fortunate morning for me," said the other. "And now here is my cab. I must be off. Good-bye."
"Good-bye," cried his friends, as he went down the steps and entered the vehicle. "Don't forget to let us know if anything further turns up."
"I will be sure to do so," said Simon Carne.
And then, as he laid himself back on the soft cushions and was driven by way of Waterloo Place to Piccadilly, he added to himself,
"Yes, if I can bring off the little scheme I have in my mind, and one or two others which I am preparing, and can manage to get out of England without anyone suspecting that I am the burglar who has outwitted all London, I shall have good cause to say that was a very fortunate day for me when I first met his lordship."
That evening he dined alone. He seemed preoccupied, and it was evident that he was disappointed about something. Several times on hearing noises in the street outside, he questioned his servants as to the cause. At last, however, when Ram Gafur entered the room carrying a telegram upon a salver, his feelings found vent in a sigh of satisfaction. With eager fingers he broke open the envelope, withdrew the contents, and read the message it contained. 7 Stars Music Hall, Whitechapel Road, 10 o'clock. There was no signature, but that fact did not seem to trouble him very much. He placed it in his pocket-book, and afterwards continued his meal in better spirits. When the servants had left the room, he poured himself out a glass of port, and taking a pencil proceeded to make certain calculations upon the back of the envelope. For nearly 10 minutes he occupied himself in this way. Then he tore the paper into tiny pieces, replaced his pencil in his pocket, and sipped his wine with a satisfaction that was the outcome of perfected arrangements.
"The public excitement," he said to himself, not without a small touch of pride, "has as yet scarcely cooled down from the robbery of the famous Wiltshire jewels. Lord Orpington has not as yet discovered the whereabouts of the gold and silver plate which disappeared from his house so mysteriously a week or 2 ago, while several other people have done their best to catch a gang of burglars who would seem to have set all London at defiance. But if I bring off this new coup, they'll forget all their grievances in consideration of the latest and greatest scandal. There'll be scarcely a man in England who won't have something to say upon the subject. By the way, let me see how he stands in the betting tonight." He took a paper from the table in the window and glanced down the sporting column. Vulcanite was evidently the public's choice, Knight of Malta being the only second favourite, with the Mandarin a strong third. "What a hubbub there will be when it becomes known," said Carne as he placed the paper on the table again. "I shall have to take especial care, or some of the storm may blow back on me. I fancy I can hear the newsboys shouting, 'Latest news of the turf scandal, the Derby favourite stolen, Vulcanite missing, an attempt made to get at Knight of Malta.' Why, it will be 20 years before old England will forget the sensation I am about to give her." With a grim chuckle at the idea, he went upstairs to his dressing room and locked the door. It must have been well after 9 o'clock when he emerged again, and, clad in a long ulster, left the house in his private hansom. Passing down Park Lane, he drove along Piccadilly, then by way of the Haymarket, Strand, Ludgate Hill, and Fenchurch Street to the Whitechapel Road. Reaching the corner of Leman Street, he signalled to his man to stop, and jumped out. His appearance was now entirely changed. Instead of the deformed, scholar-like figure he usually presented, he now resembled a commonplace farmerish individual, with iron-grey hair, a somewhat crafty face, ornamented with bushy eyebrows and a quantity of fluffy whiskers. How he had managed it as he drove along, goodness only knows, but that he had effected the change was certain. Having watched his cab drive away, he strolled along the street until he arrived at a building, the flaring lights of which proclaimed it the 7 Stars Music Hall. He paid his money at the box office, and then walked inside to find a fair-sized building, upon the floor of which were placed possibly 100 small tables. On the stage at the further end, a young lady, boasting of a minimum of clothing and a maximum of self-assurance, was explaining to the dashing accompaniment of the orchestra the adventures she had experienced when Billy and me was courting. Acting up to his appearance, Carne called for a "two of Scotch cold," and having lit a meerschaum pipe, which he took from his waistcoat pocket, prepared to make himself at home. As 10 o'clock struck, he turned his chair a little, in order that he might have a better view of the door, and waited. 5 minutes must have elapsed before his patience was rewarded. Then 2 men came in together, and immediately he saw them he turned his face in an opposite direction, and seemed to be taking an absorbing interest in what was happening upon the stage. One of the men who had entered, and whom he had seemed to recognise, a cadaverous-looking individual in a suit of clothes a size too small for him, a velvet waistcoat at least 3 sizes too large, a check tie in which was stuck an enormous horseshoe pin composed of palpably imitation diamonds, boasting no shirt as far as could be seen, and wearing upon his head a top hat of a shape that had been fashionable in the early 60s, stopped and placed his hand upon his shoulder. "Mr. Blenkins, or I'm a dizzy," he said. "Well, who'd ha' thought of seeing you here of all places? Why, it was only this afternoon as me and my friend Mr. Brown here was a speaking of you. To think as how you should have come up to London just this very time and be at the Seven Stars Music Hall, of all other places. It's like what the newspapers call a coincidence. Drat me if it ain't. How are ye, old pal?" He extended his hand, which Mr. Blenkins took, and shook with considerable cordiality. After that, Mr. Brown, who from outward appearances was by far the most respectable of the trio, was introduced in the capacity of a gentleman from America, a citizenship that became more apparent when he opened his mouth to speak. "And what was he speaking of I about?" asked Mr. Blenkins, when the trio were comfortably seated at table. This the diffident Mr. Jones, for by that commonplace appellative the seedy gentleman with the magnificent diamonds chose to be called, declined to state. It would appear that he was willing to discuss the news of the day, the price of forage, the prospects of war, the programme proceeding upon the stage, in fact, anything rather than declare the subject of his conversation with Mr. Brown that afternoon. It was not until Mr. Brown happened to ask Mr. Blenkins what horse he fancied for the Derby, that Mr. Jones in any degree recovered his self-possession. Then an animated discussion on the forthcoming race was entered upon. How long it would have lasted had not Mr. Jones presently declared that the music of the orchestra was too much for him, I cannot say. Thereupon Mr. Brown suggested that they should leave the hall and proceed to a place of which he knew in a neighbouring street. This they accordingly did, and when they were safely installed in a small room off the bar, Mr. Jones, having made certain that there was no one near enough to overhear, unlocked his powers of conversation with whisky and water, and proceeded to speak his mind. For upwards of an hour they remained closeted in the room together, conversing in an undertone. Then the meeting broke up, Mr. Blenkins bidding his friend good night before they left the house. From the outward appearances of the party, if in these days of seedy millionaires and overdressed bankrupts one may venture to judge by them, he would have been a speculative individual who would have given a £5 note for the worldly wealth of the trio. Yet, had you taken so much trouble, you might have followed Mr. Blenkins, and have seen him picked up by a smart private hansom at the corner of Leman Street. You might then have gone back to the Hen and Feathers, and have followed Mr. Brown as far as Osborne Street, and have seen him enter a neat brougham, which was evidently his own private property. Another hansom, also a private one, met Mr. Jones in the same thoroughfare, and an hour later 2 of the number were in Park Lane, while the third was discussing a bottle of Heidsieck in a gorgeous private sitting-room on the 2nd floor of the Langham Hotel. As he entered his dressing-room on his return to Portchester House, Simon Carne glanced at his watch. It was exactly 12 o'clock. "I hope Belton will not be long," he said to himself. "Give him a quarter of an hour to rid himself of the other fellow, and say half an hour to get home. In that case he should be here within the next few minutes." The thought had scarcely passed through his brain before there was a deferential knock at the door, and the next moment Belton, clad in a long greatcoat, entered the room. "You're back sooner than I expected," said Carne. "You could not have stayed very long with our friend." "I left him soon after you did, sir," said Belton. "He was in a hurry to get home, and as there was nothing more to settle, I did not attempt to prevent him. I trust you are satisfied, sir, with the result of our adventure." "Perfectly satisfied," said Carne. "Tomorrow I'll make sure that he's good for the money, and then we'll get to work. In the meantime you had better see about a van and the furniture of which I spoke to you, and also engage a man upon whom you can rely." But what about Merford, sir, and the attempt upon Knight of Malta?" "I'll see about that on Monday. I have promised Bent to spend the night there." "You'll excuse my saying so, sir, I hope," said Belton as he poured out his master's hot water and laid his dressing gown upon the back of a chair ready for him to put on. "But it's a terrible risky business. If we don't bring it off, there'll be such a noise in England as has never been heard before. You might murder the Prime Minister, I believe, and it wouldn't count for so much with the people generally as an attempt to steal the Derby favourite." "But we shall not fail," said Carne confidently. "By this time you ought to know me better than to suppose that. No, never fear, Belton. I've got all my plans cut and dried, and even if we fail to get possession of Vulcanite, the odds are 1,000 to 1 against our being suspected of any complicity in the matter. Now you can go to bed. Good night." "Good night, sir," said Belton respectfully, and left the room. It was one of Simon Carne's peculiarities always to fulfil his engagements in spite of any inconvenience they might cause himself. Accordingly, the 4 o'clock train from Waterloo, on the Monday following the meeting at the music hall just narrated, carried him to Merford in pursuance of the promise he had given his trainer. Reaching the little wayside station on the edge of the Downs, he alighted, to find himself welcomed by his trainer, who lifted his hat respectfully and wished him good afternoon. During the drive, Carne spoke of the impending race, and among other things of a letter he had that morning received, warning him of an attempt that would probably be made to obtain possession of his good horse. The trainer laughed good-humouredly. "Bless you, sir," he said, "that's nothing. You should just see some of the letters I've got pasted into my scrapbook. Most of 'em comes a week or fortnight before a big race. Some of 'em warns me that if I don't prevent the horse from starting, I'm as good as a dead man. Others ask me what price I will take to let him finish outside the first 3, while more still tell me that if I don't put him out of the way altogether, I'll find my house and my wife and family flying up to the clouds under a full charge of dynamite within 3 days of the race being run. Don't you pay any attention to the letters you receive. I'll look after the horse, and you may be very sure I'll take good care that nothing happens to him." "I know that, of course," said Carne, "but I thought I'd tell you. You see, I'm only a novice at racing, and perhaps I place more importance just now upon a threat of that kind than I shall do a couple of years hence." "Of course," replied the trainer. "I understand exactly how you feel, sir. It's quite natural. And now here we are, with the missus standing on the steps to help me give you a hearty welcome." They drove up to the door, and when Carne had alighted he was received by the trainer's wife as her lord and master had predicted. His bedroom, he discovered, on being conducted to it to prepare for dinner, was at the back of the house, overlooking the stable yard, and possessed a lovely view extending across the gardens and village towards where the Downs ended and the woods of Herberford began. "A pretty room," he said to Belton, as the latter laid out his things upon the bed, "and very convenient for our purpose. Have you discovered where you are located?" "Next door, sir." "I am glad of that. And what room is beneath us?" "The kitchen and the pantry, sir. With the exception of one at the top of the house, there are no other bedrooms on this side." "That is excellent news. Now get me ready as soon as you can." During dinner that evening Simon Carne made himself as pleasant as possible to his host and hostess. So affable indeed was he that, when they retired to rest, they confessed to each other that they had never entertained a more charming guest. It was arranged that he should be called at 5 o'clock on the morning following, in order that he might accompany the trainer to the Downs to see his horse at his exercise. It was close upon 11 o'clock when he dismissed his valet and threw himself upon his bed with a novel. For upwards of 2 hours he amused himself with his book. Then he rose and dressed himself in the rough suit which his man had put out for him. Having done so, he took a strong rope ladder from his bag, blew out his light, and opened his window. To attach the hooks at the end of the ropes to the inside of the window-sill, and to throw the rest outside, was the work of a moment. Then, having ascertained that his door was securely locked, he crawled out and descended to the ground. Once there, he waited until he saw Belton's light disappear, and heard his window softly open. Next moment a small black bag was lowered, and following it by means of another ladder came the servant himself. "There is no time to be lost," said Carne as soon as they were together. "You must set to work on the big gates while I do the other business." The men are all asleep. Nevertheless, be careful that you make no noise." Having given his instructions, he left his servant and made his way across the yard towards the box where Knight of Malta was confined. When he reached it, he unfastened the bag he had brought with him, and took from it a brace and a peculiar shaped bit, resembling a pair of compasses. Uniting these, he oiled the points and applied them to the door, a little above the lock. What he desired to do did not occupy him for more than a minute. Then he went quietly along the yard to the further boundary, where he had that afternoon noticed a short ladder. By means of this he mounted to the top of the wall, then lifted it up after him and lowered it on the other side, still without making any noise. Instead of dismounting by it, however, he seated himself for a moment astride of it, while he drew on a pair of clumsy boots he had brought with him, suspended round his neck. Then, having chosen his place, he jumped. His weight caused him to leave a good mark on the soft ground on the other side. He then walked heavily for perhaps 50 yards, until he reached the high road. Here he divested himself of his boots, put on his list slippers once more, and returned as speedily as possible to the ladder, which he mounted and drew up after him. Having descended on the other side, he left it standing against the wall, and hastened across the yard towards the gates, where he found Belton just finishing the work he had set him to do. With the aid of a brace and bit similar to that used by Carn upon the stable door, the lock had been entirely removed and the gate stood open. Belton was evidently satisfied with his work. Carn, however, was not so pleased. He picked up the circle of wood and showed it to his servant. Then, taking the bit, he inserted the screw on the reverse side and gave it 2 or 3 turns. "You might have ruined everything," he whispered, "by omitting that. The first carpenter who looked at it would be able to tell that the work was done from the inside. But thank goodness I know a trick that will set that right. Now then, give me the pads and I'll drop them by the door. Then we can return to our rooms." 4 large blanket pads were handed to him, and he went quietly across and dropped them by the stable door. After that he rejoined Belton, and they made their way, with the assistance of the ladders, back to their own rooms once more. End of section 5. Section 6 of A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. Chapter 4. Part 2. Half an hour later, Carn was wrapped in a sweet slumber, from which he did not awake until he was aroused by a tapping at his chamber door. It was the trainer. "Mr. Carn," cried Bent, in what were plainly agitated tones, "if you could make it convenient, I should be glad to speak to you as soon as possible." In something under 20 minutes he was dressed and downstairs. He found the trainer awaiting him in the hall, wearing a very serious face. "If you will stroll with me as far as the yard, I should like to show you something," he said. Carn accordingly took up his hat and followed him out. "You look unusually serious," said the latter as they crossed the garden. "An attempt has been made to get possession of your horse." Carn stopped short in his walk and faced the other. "What did I tell you yesterday?" he remarked. "I was certain that that letter was more than an idle warning." "But how do you know that an attempt has been made?" "Come, sir, and see for yourself," said Bent. "I'm sorry to say there's no gainsaying the fact." A moment later they had reached the entrance to the stable yard. "See, sir," said Bent, pointing to a circular hole which now existed where previously the lock had been. "The rascals cut out the lock, and thus gained an entry to the yard." He picked up the round piece of wood, with the lock still attached to it, and showed it to his employer. "One thing is very certain. The man who cut this lock is a master of his trade, and also the possessor of fine implements." "So it would appear," said Carn grimly. "Now what else is there for me to hear? Is the horse much hurt?" "Not a bit the worse, sir," answered Bent. "They didn't get in him, you see. Something must have frightened them before they could complete their task. Step this way, sir, if you please, and examine the door of the box for yourself. I've given strict orders that nothing shall be touched until you have seen it." They crossed the yard together and approached the box in question. On the woodwork the commencement of a circle similar to that which had been completed on the yard gates could be plainly distinguished, while on the ground below lay 4 curious-shaped pads, one of which Carn picked up. "What on earth are these things?" he asked innocently.
"Their use is easily explained, sir," answered the trainer. "They are intended for tying over the horse's feet, so that when he's led out of his box his plates may make no noise upon the stones. I'd like to have been behind 'em with a whip when they got him out, that's all. The double-dyed rascals, to try such a trick upon a horse in my charge."
"I can understand your indignation," said Carn. "It seems to me we have had a very narrow escape."
"Narrow escape or no narrow escape, I'd have 'em safely locked up in Melford Police Station by this time," replied Bent vindictively. "And now, sir, let me show you how they got out. As far as I can see, they must have imagined they heard somebody coming from the house, otherwise they would have left by the gates instead of by this ladder." He pointed to the ladder, which was still standing where Carn had placed it, and then led him by a side door round to the other side of the wall. Here he pointed to some heavy footmarks upon the turf. Carn examined them closely. "If the size of his boot is any criterion of his build," he said, "he must have been a precious big fellow. Let me see how mine compares with it." He placed his neat shoe in one of the imprints before him, and smiled as he noticed how the other overlapped it. They then made their way to the box, where they found the animal at his breakfast. He lifted his head and glanced round at them, bit at the iron of the manger, and then gave a little playful kick with one of his hind legs.
"He doesn't seem any the worse for his adventure," said Carn as the trainer went up to him and ran his hand over his legs.
"Not a bit," answered the other. "He's a wonderfully even-tempered horse, and it takes a lot to put him out. If his nerves had been at all upset, he wouldn't have licked up his food as clean as he has done." Having given another look at him, they left him in charge of his lad, and returned to the house. The gallop after breakfast confirmed their conclusion that there was nothing the matter, and Simon Carn returned to town ostensibly comforted by Bent's solemn assurance to that effect. That afternoon Lord Callingforth, the owner of Vulcanite, called upon him. They had met repeatedly, and consequently were on the most intimate terms. "Good afternoon, Carn," he said as he entered the room. "I have come to condole with you upon your misfortune, and to offer you my warmest sympathy."
"Why, what on earth has happened?"
asked Carn as he offered his visitor a cigar.
"God bless my soul, my dear fellow, haven't you seen the afternoon paper? Why, it reports the startling news that your stables were broken into last night, and that my rival, Knight of Malta, was missing this morning."
Carn laughed.
"I wonder what they'll say next," he said quietly. "But don't let me appear to deceive you. It is perfectly true that the stables were broken into last night, but the thieves were disturbed and decamped just as they were forcing the lock of the knight's box."
"In that case I congratulate you. What rascally inventions some of these sporting papers do get hold of, to be sure. I am indeed glad to hear that it is not true. The race would have lost half its interest if your horse were out of it. By the way, I suppose you're still as confident as ever?"
"Would you like to test it?"
"Very much, if you feel inclined for a bet."
"Then I'll have a level £1,000 with you that my horse beats yours, both to start or the wager is off. Do you agree?"
"With pleasure. I'll make a note of it." The noble Earl jotted the bet down in his book, and then changed the subject by inquiring whether Carn had ever had any transactions with his next-door neighbour, Klimo.
"Only on one occasion," the other replied. "I consulted him on behalf of the Duke of Wiltshire, at the time his wife's diamonds were stolen. To tell the truth, I was half thinking of calling him in to see if he could find the fellow who broke into the stables last night, but on second thoughts I determined not to do so. I did not want to make any more fuss about it than I could help. But what makes you ask about Klimo?"
"Well, to put the matter in a nutshell, there has been a good deal of small pilfering down at my trainer's place lately, and I want to get it stopped."
"If I were you, I should wait until after the race, and then have him down. If one excites public curiosity just now, one never knows what will happen."
"I think you are right. Anyhow, I'll act on your advice. Now, what do you say to coming along to the rooms with me to see how our horses stand in the market? Your presence there would do more than any number of paper denials towards showing the fallacy of this stupid report.
Will you come?"
"With pleasure,"
said Carne, and in less than 5 minutes he was sitting beside the noble Earl in his mail phaeton, driving towards the rooms in question. When he got there he found Lord Callingforth had stated the case very correctly. The report that Knight of Malta had been stolen had been widely circulated, and Carne discovered that the animal was, for the moment, almost a dead letter in the market. The presence of his owner, however, was sufficient to stay the panic, and when he had snapped up 2 or 3 long bets, which a few moments before had been going begging, the horse began steadily to rise towards his old position. That night, when Belton waited upon his master at bedtime, he found him, if possible, more silent than usual. It was not until his work was well nigh completed that the other spoke.
"It's a strange thing, Belton," he said, "and you may hardly believe it, but if there were not certain reasons to prevent me from being so magnanimous, I would give this matter up, and let the race be run on its merits. I don't know that I ever took a scheme in hand with a worse grace. However, as it can't be helped, I suppose I must go through with it. Is the van prepared?"
"It is quite ready, sir."
"All the furniture arranged as I directed?"
"It is exactly as you wished, sir. I have attended to it myself."
"And what about the man?"
"I have engaged the young fellow, sir, who assisted me before. I know he's quick, and I can stake my life he's trustworthy."
"I am glad to hear it. He will have need to be. Now for my arrangements. I shall make the attempt on Friday morning next, that is to say, 2 days from now. You and the man you have just mentioned will take the van and horses to Market Stopford, travelling by the goods train which, I have discovered, reaches the town between 4 and 5 in the morning. As soon as you are out of the station you will start straight away along the high road towards Exbridge, reaching the village between 5 and 6. I shall meet you in the road alongside the 3rd milestone on the other side, made up for the part I am to play. Do you understand?"
"Perfectly, sir."
"That will do then. I shall go down to the village tomorrow evening, and you will not hear from me again until you meet me at the place I have named. Good night."
"Good night, sir." Now it is a well-known fact that if you wish to excite the anger of the inhabitants of Exbridge village, and more particularly of any member of the Pitman training establishment, you have but to ask for information concerning a certain blind beggar who put in an appearance there towards sunset on the Thursday preceding the Derby of 1800 , and you will do so. When that mysterious individual first came in sight, he was creeping along the dusty high road that winds across the downs from Market Stopford to Beaton Junction, dolorously quavering a ballad that was intended to be, though few would have recognised it, the wearing of the green. On reaching the stables he tapped along the wall with his stick until he came to the gate. Then, when he was asked his business by the head lad, who had been called up by one of the stable boys, he stated that he was starving, and with peculiar arts of his own induced them to provide him with a meal. For upwards of an hour he remained talking with the lads, and then wended his way down the hill towards the village, where he further managed to induce the rector to permit him to occupy one of his outhouses for the night. After tea he went out and sat on the green, but towards 8 o'clock he crossed the stream at the ford and made his way up to a little copse, which ornamented a slight eminence on the opposite side of the village to that upon which the training stables were situated. How he found his way, considering his infirmity, it is difficult to say, but that he did find it was proved by his presence there. It might also have been noticed that when he was once under cover of the bushes, he gave up tapping the earth with his stick, and walked straight enough, and without apparent hesitation, to the stump of a tree upon which he seated himself. For some time he enjoyed the beauty of the evening, undisturbed by the presence of any other human being. Then he heard a step behind him, and next moment a smart-looking stable lad parted the bushes and came into view. "Hullo," said the newcomer, "so you managed to get here first?"
"So I have," said the old rascal, "and it's wonderful when you come to think of it, considering my age and what a poor old blind chap I be. But I'm glad to find you've managed to get away, my lad. Now what have you got to say for yourself?"
"I don't know that I've got anything to say," replied the boy, "but this much is certain, what you want can't be done."
"And a fine young cockerel you are, to be sure, to crow so loud that it can't be done," said the old fellow with an evil chuckle. "How do you know it can't?"
"Because I don't see my way," replied the other. "It's too dangerous by a long sight. Why, if the governor was to get wind of what you want me to do, England itself wouldn't be big enough to hold us both. You don't know him as well as I do." "I know him well enough for all practical purposes," replied the beggar. "Now, if you've got any more objections to raise, be quick about it. If you haven't, then I'll talk to you. You haven't? Very good then. Now just hold your jaw, open your ears, and listen to what I've got to say. What time do you go to exercise tomorrow morning?"
9 o'clock.
"Very good then. You go down onto the downs, and the boss sends you off with vulcanite for a canter. What do? Why, you go steadily enough as long as he can see you, but directly you're round on the other side of the hill, you stick in your heels and nip into the wood that runs along on your right hand, just as if your horse was bolting with you. Once in there, you go through for a half-mile until you come to the stream. Ford that, and then cut into the next wood, riding as if the devil himself were after you, until you reach the path above Hangman's Hollow. Do you know the place?"
"I reckon I ought to."
"Well then, you just make tracks for it. When you get there, you'll find me waiting for you. After that, I'll take over command, and get both you and the horse out of England in such a way that nobody will ever suspect. Then there'll be £500 for your trouble, a safe passage with the horse to South America, and another 500 the day the nag is set ashore. There's not as much risk as you could take between your finger and thumb, and a lad with a spirit like yours could make a fortune with £1,000 on the other side. What have you to say now?"
"It's all very well," replied the lad, "but how am I to know that you'll play straight with me?"
"What do you take me for?" said the beggar indignantly, at the same time putting his hand in his coat pocket and producing what looked like a crumpled piece of paper. "If you doubt me, there's something that may help to convince you. But don't go showing it around tonight, or you'll be giving yourself away, and that'll mean the stone jug for you, and amen to all your hopes of a fortune. You'll do as I wish now, I suppose?"
"I'll do it," said the lad sullenly, as he crumpled the banknote up and put it in his pocket. "But now I must be off. Since there's been this fuss about Knight of Malta, the governor has us all in before 8 o'clock, and keeps the horse under lock and key, with the head lad sleeping in the box with him."
"Well, good night to you, and don't you forget about tomorrow morning. Niggle the horse about a bit just to make him impatient like, and drop a hint that he's a bit fresh. That will make his bolting look more feasible. Don't leave the track while there's anyone near you, but as soon as you do, ride like thunder to the place I told you of. I'll see that they're put off the scent as to the way you've gone."
"All right," said the lad. "I don't like it, but I suppose I'm in too deep now to draw back. Good night."
"Good night, and good luck to you." Once he had got rid of the youth, Carne, for it was he, returned by another route to the rector's outbuilding, where he laid himself down on the straw and was soon fast asleep. His slumbers lasted till nearly daybreak, when he rose and made his way across country to the small copse above Hangman's Hollow on the road from Exbridge to Beaton Junction. Here he discovered a large van, drawn up apparently laden with furniture both inside and out. The horses were feeding beneath a tree, and a couple of men were eating their breakfast beside them. On seeing Carne, the taller of them, a respectable-looking workman with a big brown beard, rose and touched his hat. The other looked with astonishment at the disreputable beggar standing before them. "So you arrived here safely," said Carne. "If anything, you're a little before your time. Boil a cup of tea and give me something to eat as quickly as possible, for I'm nearly famished. When you've done that, get out the clothes I told you to bring with you, and let me change into them. It wouldn't do for any of the people from the village back yonder to be able to say afterwards that they saw me talking with you in this rig-out." As soon as his hunger was appeased, he disappeared into the wood, and dressed himself in his new attire. Another suit of clothes, and an apron such as might be worn by a furniture remover's foreman, a grey wig, a short grey beard and moustache, and a bowler hat, changed his identity completely. Indeed, when his rags had been hidden in the hollow of a tree, it would have been a difficult matter to have traced any resemblance between the respectable-looking workman eating his breakfast and the disreputable beggar of half an hour before. It was close upon 9 o'clock by this time, and as soon as he realised this, Carne gave the order to put the horses to. This done, they turned their attention to the back of the van, and then a strange thing became apparent. Though to all appearances, viewed from the open doors at the end, the inside of this giant receptacle was filled to its utmost capacity with chests of drawers, chairs, bedsteads, carpets, and other articles of household furniture, yet by pulling a pair of handles it was possible for two men easily to withdraw what looked like half the contents of the van. The poorest observer would then have noticed that in almost every particular these articles were dummies, affixed to a screen, capable of being removed at a moment's notice. The remainder of the van was fitted after the fashion of a stable, with a manger at the end and a pair of slings dependent from the roof. The nervous tension produced by the waiting soon became almost more than the men could bear. Minute after minute went slowly by, and still the eagerly expected horse did not put in an appearance. Then Belton, whom Carne had placed on the lookout, came flying towards him with the report that he could hear a sound of galloping hoofs in the wood. A few seconds later the noise could be plainly heard at the van, and almost before they had time to comment upon it, a magnificent thoroughbred, ridden by the stable boy who had talked to the blind beggar on the previous evening, dashed into view and pulled up beside the van. "Jump off!" cried Carne, catching at the horse's head, "and remove the saddle. Now be quick with those cloths. We must rub him down or he'll catch cold." When the horse was comparatively dry, he was led into the van, which was to be his stable for the next few hours, and in spite of his protests, slung in such a fashion that his feet did not touch the floor. This business completed, Carne bade the frightened boy get in with him, and take care that he did not on any account neigh. After that the mask of furniture was replaced, and the doors closed and locked. The men mounted to their places on the box and roof, and the van continued its journey along the highway towards the junction. But satisfactory as their attempt had so far proved, the danger was by no means over. Scarcely had they proceeded 3 miles on their way before Carne distinguished the sound of hoofs upon the road behind him. A moment later a young man, mounted on a well-bred horse, came into view, rode up alongside, and signalled to the driver to stop. "What's the matter?" inquired the latter, as he brought his horses to a standstill. "Have we dropped anything?" "Have you seen anything of a boy on a horse?" asked the man, who was so much out of breath that he could scarcely get his words out. "What sort of boy, and what sort of a horse?" asked the man on the van. "A youngish boy," was the reply, 7 stone weight, with sandy hair, on a thoroughbred." "No, we ain't seen no boy with sandy hair riding on a thoroughbred horse, 7 stone weight," said Carne. "What's he been and done?" "The horse has bolted with him off the downs, back yonder," answered the man. "The governor has sent us out in all directions to look for him." "Sorry we can't oblige you," said the driver, as he prepared to start his team again. "Good day to you." "Much obliged," said the horseman, and when he had turned off into a side road, the van continued its journey till it reached the railway station. A quarter of an hour later it caught the 11 o'clock goods train and set off for the small seaside town of Barworth on the south coast, where it was shipped on board a steamer which had arrived that morning from London. Once it was safely transferred from the railway truck to the deck, Carne was accosted by a tall swarthy individual, who from his importance seemed to be both the owner and the skipper of the vessel. They went down into the saloon together, and a few moments later an observer, had one been there, might have seen a cheque for a considerable sum of money change hands. An hour later the Jessie Branker was steaming out to sea, and a military-looking individual, not at all to be compared with the industrious mechanic who had shipped the furniture van on board the vessel bound for Spain, stood on the platform of the station waiting for the express train to London. On reaching the metropolis he discovered it surging beneath the weight of a great excitement. The streets re-echoed with the raucous cries of the newsvendors. "The Derby favourite stolen! Vulcanite missing from his stable!" Next morning an advertisement appeared in every paper of consequence, offering a reward of £500 for any information that might lead to the conviction of the person or persons who on the morning of May 28th had stolen or caused to be stolen from the Pitman training stables the Derby favourite Vulcanite, the property of the Right Honourable the Earl of Callingforth. The week following, Knight of Malta, owned by Simon Carne, Esquire, of Dorchester House, Park Lane, won the Derby by a neck in a scene of intense excitement, the Mandarin being second and the filibuster third. It is a strange fact that to this day not a member of the racing world has been able to solve the mystery surrounding the disappearance of one of the greatest horses that ever set foot on an English racecourse.
Today, if Simon Carne thinks of that momentous occasion,
when, amid the shouting crowd of Epsom, he led his horse back a winner, he smiles softly to himself and murmurs beneath his breath, valued at £20,000, and beaten in the Derby by a furniture van.
End of section 6. End of chapter 4.
Section 7 of A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. Chapter 5, Part 1. A Service to the State. It was the day following that upon which Simon Carne, presented by the Earl of Amberley, had made his bow before the heir apparent at the second levee of the season, that Klimo entered upon one of the most interesting cases which had so far come into his experience. The clock in his consulting room had just struck 1 when his elderly housekeeper entered and handed him a card bearing the name of Mrs. George Jeffreys, 14 Bellamer Street, Bloomsbury. The detective immediately bade his servant admit the visitor, and almost before he had given the order, the lady in question stood before him. She was young, not more than 24 at most, a frail wisp of a girl, with light brown hair and eyes that spoke for her nationality as plain as any words. She was neatly but by no means expensively dressed, and showed evident signs of being oppressed by a weight of trouble. Klimo looked at her, and in that glance took in everything. In spite of the fact that he was reputed to possess a heart as hard as any flint, it was noticeable that his voice, when he spoke to her, was not as gruff as that in which he usually addressed his visitors. "Pray sit down," he said, "and tell me in as few words as possible what it is you desire that I should do for you. Speak as clearly as you can, and if you want my help, don't hesitate to tell me everything." The girl sat down as ordered, and immediately commenced her tale. "My name is Eileen Jeffreys," said she. "I am the wife of an English bank inspector, and the daughter of Septimus O'Grady of Chicago, USA. "I shall remember," replied Klimo. "And how long have you been married?" 2 years, answered the girl. 2 years next September. My husband and I met in America, and then came to England to settle." "In saying good-bye to your old home, you left your father behind, I presume?" "Yes, he preferred to remain in America." "May I ask his profession?" "That, I'm afraid, foolish as it may seem to say so, I cannot tell you," answered the girl, with a slightly heightened colour. "His means of earning a living were always kept a secret from me." "That was rather strange, was it not?" said Klimo. "Had he private resources?" "None that I ever heard of," replied the girl. "Did no business men ever come to see him?" "But very few people came to us at all. We had scarcely any friends." "Of what nationality were the friends who did come?" "Mostly Irish, like ourselves," answered Mrs. Jeffreys. "Was there ever any quarrel between your father and your husband prior to your leaving America?" "Never any downright quarrel," said the girl. "But I am sorry to say they were not always the best of friends. In those days my father was a very difficult man to get on with." "Indeed," said Klimo. "Now perhaps you had better proceed with your story." "To do that, I must explain that at the end of January of this present year, my father, who was then in Chicago, sent us a cablegram to say he was leaving for England that very day, and that upon his arrival in England, if we had no objection, he would like to take up his residence with us. He was to sail from New York on the Saturday following, and as you know, the passage takes 6 days or thereabouts. Arriving in England, he came to London and put up at our house in Bellamer Street, Bloomsbury. That was during the first week in February last, and off and on he has been living with us ever since." "Have you any idea what brought him to England?" "Not the least," she answered deliberately, after a few seconds' pause, which Klimo did not fail to notice. "Did he do business with anyone that you are aware of?" "I cannot say. On several occasions he went away for a week at a time into the Midlands, but what took him there I have no possible idea. On the last occasion he left us on the 15th of last month,
and returned on the 9th of this, the same day that my husband was called away to Marseille on important banking business. It was easy to see that he was not well. He was feverish, and within a short time of my getting him to bed he began to wander in his mind, declaring over and over again that he bitterly repented some action he had taken, and that if he could once consider himself safe again, he would be quit of the whole thing forever. For close upon a fortnight I continued to nurse him, until he was so far recovered as to recognize me once more. The day that he did so, I took in at the door this cablegram, from which I may perhaps date the business that has brought me to you." She took a paper from her pocket and handed it to Klimo, who glanced at it, examined the postmark and the date, and then placed it upon the desk before him. It was from Chicago, and ran as follows: "O'Grady, 14 Bellamere Street, London, England. Why no answer? Reply chances of doing business. Nero." Of course it was impossible for me to tell what this meant. I was not in my father's confidence, and I had no notion who this mysterious correspondent might be. But as the doctor had distinctly stated that to allow him to consider any business at all would bring on a relapse, and probably kill him, I placed the message in a drawer and determined to let it remain there until he should be well enough to attend to it without danger to himself. The week following he was not quite so well, and fortunately there was complete silence on the part of his correspondents. Then this second message arrived. As you will see, it is also from Chicago, and from the same person. "Reply immediately, or remember consequences. Time presses. If you do not realize at present price, market will be lost. Nero." Following my previous line of action, I placed this communication also in the drawer, and determined to let Nero wait for a reply. By doing so, however, I was incurring greater trouble than I dreamt of. Within 48 hours I received the following message, and upon that I made up my mind and came off at once to you. What it means I do not know, but that it bodes some ill to my father I feel certain. I had heard of your fame, and as my husband is away from home, my father unable to protect himself, and I am without friends at all in England, I thought the wisest course I could pursue would be to consult you." "Let me look at the last cablegram," said Klimo, putting his hand from the box and taking the slip of paper. The first and second message were simplicity itself. This, however, was a complete enigma. It was worded as follows: "Uneasy, Alpha, Omega, 19, 12, today, 5, lakhs, arrange, 70, 8, Brazils, 1, 20, 9. Nero." Klimo read it through, and the girl noticed that he shook his head over it. "My dear young lady," he said, "I am afraid that it would be safer for you not to tell me any further, for I fear it is not in my power to help you." "You will not help me now that I have told you my miserable position? Then there is nothing before me but despair. Oh, sir, is your decision quite irrevocable? You cannot think how I have counted on your assistance." "I regret exceedingly that I am compelled to disappoint you," he answered, "but my time is more than occupied as it is, and I could not give your case my attention even if I would." His decision had been too much for her fortitude, and before he could prevent it, her head was down upon her hands, and she had begun to weep bitterly. He attempted to comfort her, but in vain, and when she left him, tears were still coursing down her cheeks. It was not until she had been gone about 10 minutes, and he had informed his housekeeper that he would see no more clients that day, that he discovered that she had left her precious cablegrams behind her. Actuated by a feeling of curiosity, he sat down again and spread the 3 cablegrams out upon his writing table. The first 2, as I have said, required no consideration. They spoke for themselves. But the third baffled him completely. Who was this Septimus O'Grady who lived in Chicago, and whose associates spent their time discussing the wrongs of Ireland? How was it that, being a man innocent of private means, he engaged in no business? Then another question called for consideration. If he had no business, what brought him to London?
and took him so repeatedly into the Midlands. These riddles he set aside for the present, and began to pick the last cablegram to pieces. That its author was not easy in his mind when he wrote it was quite certain. Then who and what were the Alpha and Omega mentioned? What connection had they with Nero? Also, what did 19 and 12 mean when coupled with today? Further, why should 5 lakhs arrange 78 Brazils? And what possible sense could be made out of the numbers 1, 20, and 9? He read the message from beginning to end again, after that from the end to the beginning, and like a good many other men in a similar position, because he could not understand it, found himself taking a greater interest in it. This feeling had not left him when he had put off disguise as Clemo and was Simon Carne once more. While he was eating his lunch, the thought of the lonely Irishman lying ill in a house where he was without doubt an unwelcome guest fascinated him strangely, and when he rose from the table he found he was not able to shake off the impression it had given him. That the girl had some notion of her father's business he felt as certain as of his own name, even though she had so strenuously denied the fact. Otherwise, why should she have been so frightened by what might have been simply innocent business messages in cipher? That she was frightened was as plain as the sun then shining into his room. Despite the fact that he had resolved not to take up the case, he went into his study and took the cablegrams from the drawer in which he had placed them. Then, drawing a sheet of paper towards him, he set to work upon the puzzle. "The first word requires no explanation," he said as he wrote it down. "For the next 2, Alpha and Omega, we will, for the sake of argument, write the beginning and the end, and as that tells us nothing, we will substitute for them the first and the last. Now, who or what are the first and the last? Are they the first and last words of a code, or of a word, or do they refer to 2 individuals who are the principal folk in some company or conspiracy? If the latter, it is just possible they are the people who are so desperately uneasy. The next 2 words, however, are too much for me altogether." Uninteresting as the case appeared at first sight, he soon discovered that he could think of nothing else. He found himself puzzling over it during an afternoon concert at the Queen's Hall, and he even thought of it while calling upon the wife of the Prime Minister afterwards. As he drove in the park before dinner, the wheels of his carriage seemed to be saying Alpha and Omega, 19, 12, over and over again, with pitiless reiteration. And by the time he reached home once more, he would gladly have paid a £10 note for a feasible solution of the enigma, if only to get its weight off his mind. While waiting for dinner, he took pen and paper and wrote the message out again, this time in half a dozen different ways. But the effect was the same, none of them afforded him any clue. He then took the second letter of each word, after that the third, then the fourth, and so on, until he had exhausted them. The result in each case was absolute gibberish, and he felt that he was no nearer understanding it than when Mrs. Jeffreys had handed it to him nearly 8 hours before. During the night he dreamt about it, and when he woke in the morning its weight was still upon his mind. 1912, it is true, had left him, but he was not better off for the reason that 78 Brazils had taken its place. When he got out of bed he tried it again, but at the end of half an hour his patience was exhausted. "Confound the thing!" he said as he threw the paper from him and seated himself in a chair before his looking-glass, in order that his confidential valet, Belton, might shave him. "I'll think no more of it. Mrs. Jeffreys must solve the mystery for herself. It has worried me too much already." He laid his head back upon the rest, and allowed his valet to run the soap-brush over his chin. But however much he might desire it, his old man of the sea was not to be discarded so easily. The word Brazils seemed to be painted in letters of fire upon the ceiling. As the razor glided over his cheek, he thought of the various constructions to be placed upon the word, the country, stocks, and even nuts, Brazil nuts, Spanish nuts, Barcelona nuts, walnuts, cob nuts, and then, as if to make the nightmare more complete, no less a thing than Nuttall's dictionary. The smile the last suggestion caused him came within an ace of leaving its mark upon his cheek. He signed to the man to stay his hand. "Egad!" he cried, "who knows but this may be the solution of the mystery?"
Go down to the study, Belton, and bring me Nuttall's dictionary." He waited with one side of his face still soaped until his valet returned, bringing with him the desired volume. Having received it, he placed it upon the table and took up the telegram. 78 Brazils, it said, 1:29. Accordingly he chose the 70th page and ran his fingers down the first column. The letter was B, but the 8th word proved useless. He thereupon turned to the 78th page, and in the first column discovered the word bomb. In a second the whole aspect of the case changed, and he became all eagerness and excitement. The last words on the telegram were 1:29, yet it was plain that there were barely 100 upon the page. The only explanation, therefore, was that the word 1 distinguished the column, and the 29 referred to the number of the word in it. Almost trembling with eagerness, he began to count. Surely enough the 29th word was bomb. The coincidence was, to say the least of it, extraordinary. But presuming that it was correct, the rest of the message was simplicity itself. He turned the telegram over, and upon the back transcribed the communication as he imagined it should be read. When he had finished, it ran as follows: "Owing to O'Grady's silence, the society in Chicago is growing uneasy. 2 men who are the first and last, or in other words the principal members, are going to do something, 1912, today, with 50,000 somethings, so arrange about the bombs." Having got so far, all that remained to be done was to find out to what 1912 referred. He turned to the dictionary again, and looked for the 12th word upon the 19th page. This proved to be Alchemist, which told him nothing, so he reversed the proceedings and looked for the 19th word upon the 12th page. But this proved even less satisfactory than before. However much the dictionary might have helped him hitherto, it was plainly useless now. He thought and thought, but without success. He turned up the almanac, but the dates did not fit in. He then wrote the letters of the alphabet upon a sheet of paper, and against each placed its equivalent number. The 19th letter was S, the 12th L. Did they represent 2 words, or were they the first and the last letters of a word? In that case, what could it be? The only 3 he could think of were soil, cell, and sail. The first 2 were hopeless, but the last seemed better. But how would that fit in? He took up his pen and tried it. "Owing to O'Grady's silence, the society in Chicago is growing uneasy. 2 men who are the first and last, or in other words the principal members, sail today, with 50,000 somethings, probably pounds or dollars, so prepare bombs. Nero." He felt convinced that he had hit it at last. Either it was a very extraordinary coincidence, or he had discovered the answer to the riddle. If this solution were correct, one thing was certain: he had got in his hands, quite by chance, a clue to one of the biggest Fenian conspiracies ever yet brought to light. He remembered that at that moment London contained half the crowned heads, or the representatives, of Europe. What better occasion could the enemies of law and order desire for striking a blow at the government and society in general? What was he to do? To communicate with the police, and thus allow himself to be drawn into the affair, would be an act of the maddest folly. Should he therefore drop the whole thing, as he had at first proposed? Or should he take the matter into his own hands, help Mrs. Jeffreys in her trouble by shipping her father out of harm's way, outwit the Fenians, and appropriate the £50,000 mentioned in the cablegram himself? The last idea was distinctly a good one, but before it could be done he felt he must be certain of his facts. Was the 50,000 referred to money, or was it something else? If the former, was it pounds or was it dollars? There was a vast difference, but in either case, if only he could hit on a safe scheme, he might be well repaid for whatever risk he might run. He decided to see Mrs. Jeffreys without loss of time. Accordingly, after breakfast, he sent her a note asking her to call upon him without fail at 12 o'clock. Punctuality is not generally considered a virtue possessed by the sex of which Mrs. Jeffreys was so unfortunate a member, but the clock upon Klimo's mantelpiece had scarcely struck the hour before she put in an appearance. He immediately bade her be seated. "Mrs. Jeffreys," he began with a severely judicial air, It is with much regret I find that, while seeking my advice yesterday, you were all the time deceiving me. How was it that you failed to tell me that your father was connected with a Fenian society, whose one aim and object is to destroy law and order in this country?" The question evidently took the girl by surprise. She became deathly pale, and for a moment Klimo thought she was going to faint. With a marvellous exhibition of will, however, she pulled herself together and faced her accuser. "You have no right to say such a thing," she began. "My father is—" "Pardon me," he answered quietly, "but I am in the possession of information which enables me to understand exactly what he is. If you answer me correctly, it is probable that after all I will take your case up, and will help you to save your father's life. But if you decline to do so, ill as he is, he will be arrested within 24 hours, and then nothing on earth can save him from condign punishment. Which do you prefer?"
"I will tell you everything," she said quickly. "I ought to have done so at first, but you can understand why I shrank from it. My father has for a long time past been ashamed of the part he has been playing, but he could not help himself. He was too valuable to them, and they would not let him slip. They drove him on, and it was his remorse and anxiety that broke him down at last."
"I think you have chosen the better course in telling me this. I will ask my questions, and you can answer them. To begin with, where are the headquarters of the society?"
"In Chicago."
"I thought as much. And is it possible for you to tell me the names of the two principal members?"
"There are many members, and I don't know that one is greater than another."
"But there must be some who are more important than others. For instance, the pair referred to in this telegram as Alpha and Omega."
"I can only think," she answered, after a moment's thought, "that they must be the two men who came oftenest to our house, Messrs. Maguire and Rooney."
"Can you describe them, or, better still, have you their photographs?"
"I have a photograph of Mr. Rooney. It was taken last year."
"You must send it to me as soon as you get home," he said. "And now give me as close a description as possible of the other person to whom you refer, Mr. Maguire."
Mrs. Jeffreys considered for a few moments before she answered. "He is tall, standing fully 6 feet, I should think," she said at last, "with red hair and watery blue eyes, in the left of which there is a slight cast. He is broad-shouldered, and, in spite of his long residence in America, speaks with a decided brogue. I know them for desperate men, and if they come over to England, may God help us all. Mr. Klimo, you don't think the police will take my father?"
"Not if you implicitly obey my instructions," he answered.
Klimo thought for a few seconds, and then continued.
"If you wish me to undertake this business, which I need hardly tell you is out of my usual line, you will now go home and send me the photograph you spoke of a few moments since. After that you will take no sort of action until you hear from me again. For certain reasons of my own, I shall take this matter up, and will do my utmost to save your father. One word of advice first: say nothing to anybody, but pack your father's boxes, and be prepared to get him out of England, if necessary at a moment's notice."
The girl rose and made as if she would leave the room, but instead of doing so she stood irresolute. For a few moments she said nothing, but fumbled with the hand of her parasol and breathed heavily. Then the pluck which had so far sustained her gave way entirely, and she fell back on her chair, crying as if her heart would break. Klimo instantly left his box and went round to her. He made a figure queer enough to please anyone, in his old-fashioned clothes, his skull-cap, his long grey hair reaching almost to his shoulders, and with his smoked-glass spectacles perched upon his nose. "Why cry, my dear young lady?" said Klimo. "Have I not promised to do my best for you? Let us, however, understand each other thoroughly. If there is anything you are keeping back, you must tell me. By not speaking out, you are imperilling your own and your father's safety."
"I know that you must think that I am endeavouring to deceive you," she said, "but I am so terribly afraid of committing myself that I hardly know what to tell and what not to tell. I have come to you, having no friends in the whole world save my husband, who is in Marseille, and my father, who, as I have said, is lying dangerously ill in our house. Of course I know what my father has been. Surely you cannot suppose that a grown-up girl like myself could be so dense as not to guess why few save Irishmen visited our house, and why at times there were men staying with us for weeks at a time who lived in the back rooms and never went outside our front door, and who, when they did take their departure, sneaked out in the dead of night. I remember a time, in the fall of the last year that I was at home, when there were more meetings than ever, and when these men, Maguire and Rooney, almost lived with us. They and my father were occupied day and night in a room at the top of the house, and then in the January following Maguire came to England. 3 weeks later the papers were full of a terrible dynamite explosion in London, in which 40 innocent people lost their lives. Mr. Klimo, you must imagine for yourself the terror and shame that seized me, particularly when I remembered that my father was a companion of the men who had been concerned in it. Now my father repents, and they are edging him on to some fresh outrage. I cannot tell you what it is, but I know this, that if Maguire and Rooney are coming to England, something awful is about to happen, and if they distrust him, and there is any chance of anyone getting into trouble, my father will be made the scapegoat. To run away from them would be to court certain death. They have agents in almost every European city, and unless we could get right away to the other side of the world, they would be certain to catch us. Besides, my father is too ill to travel. The doctors say he must not be disturbed under any pretence whatever."
"Well, well," said Klimo, "leave the matter to me, and I will see what can be done. Send me the photograph you spoke of, and let me know instantly if there are any further developments."
"Do you mean that after all I can rely upon you helping me?"
"If you are brave," he answered, "not without. Now, one last question, and then you must be off. I see in the last telegram mention made of 50 lakhs. I presume that means money?"
"A lakh is their term for £1,000," she answered without hesitation.
"That will do," said Klimo. "Now go home and don't worry yourself more than you can help. Above all, don't let anyone suspect that I have any interest in the case. Upon your doing that will in a great measure depend your safety." She promised to obey him in this particular as in the others, and then took her departure. When Klimo had passed into the adjoining house, he bade his valet accompany him to his study. "Belton," he said, as he seated himself in a comfortable chair before his writing table, "I have this morning agreed to undertake what promises to be one of the most dangerous, and at the same time most interesting, cases that has yet come under my notice. A young lady, the wife of a respectable bank inspector, has been twice to see me lately, with a very sad story. Her father, it would appear, is an Irish American, with the usual prejudice against this country. He has been for some time a member of a Fenian society, possibly one of their most active workers. In January last the executive sent him to his country to arrange for an exhibition of their powers. Since arriving here the father has been seized with remorse, and the mental strain and fear thus entailed have made him seriously ill. For weeks he has been lying at death's door in his daughter's house. Hearing nothing from him, the society has telegraphed again and again, but without result. In consequence, 2 of the chief and most dangerous members are coming over here with £50,000 at their disposal to look after their erring brother, to take over the management of affairs, and to commence the slaughter as per arrangement. Now, as a peaceable citizen of the City of London, and a humble servant of Her Majesty the Queen, it is manifestly my duty to deliver these rascals into the hands of the police. But to do that would be to implicate the girl's father, and to kill her husband's faith in her family. For it must be remembered he knows nothing of the father's Fenian tendencies. It would also mix me up in a most undesirable matter at a time when I have the best reasons for desiring to keep quiet.
End of section 7. Section 8 of A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Gillian Hendry. A Prince of Swindlers by Guy Boothby. Chapter 5, Part 2.
Well, the long and the short of the matter is that I have been thinking the question out, and I have arrived at the following conclusion. If I can hit upon a workable scheme, I shall play policeman and public benefactor, checkmate the dynamiters, save the girl and her father, and reimburse myself to the extent of £50,000. £50,000, Belton, think of that. If it hadn't been for the money, I should have had nothing at all to do with it.
But how will you do it, sir? Asked Belton, who had learnt by experience never to be surprised at anything his master might say or do.
Well, so far, he answered, it seems a comparatively easy matter. I see that the last telegram was dispatched on Saturday, May 26th, and says, or purports to say, sail today. In that case, all being well, they should be in Liverpool some time tomorrow, Thursday. So we have a clear day at our disposal in which to prepare a reception for them. Tonight I am to have a photograph of one of the men in my possession, and tomorrow I shall send you to Liverpool to meet them. Once you have set eyes on them, you must not lose sight of them until you have discovered where they are domiciled in London. After that I will take the matter in hand myself.
At what hour do you wish me to start for Liverpool, sir? Asked Belton.
First thing tomorrow morning, his master replied. In the meantime you must, by hook or crook, obtain a police inspector's, sergeant's, and 2 constables' uniforms, with belts and helmets complete. Also I shall require 3 men in whom I can place absolute and implicit confidence. They must be big fellows, with plenty of pluck and intelligence, and the clothes you get must fit them so that they shall not look awkward in them. They must also bring plain clothes with them, for I shall want 2 of them to undertake a journey to Ireland. They will each be paid £100 for the job, and to ensure their silence afterwards. Do you think you can find me the men without disclosing my connection with the matter?
I know exactly where to put my hand upon them, sir, remarked Belton. And for the sum you mention, it's my belief they'd hold their tongues forever, no matter what pressure was brought to bear upon them.
Very good. You had better communicate with them at once, and tell them to hold themselves in readiness, for I may want them at any moment. On Friday night I shall probably attempt the job, and they can get back to town when and how they like.
Very good, sir. I'll see about them this afternoon without fail. Next morning Belton left London for Liverpool, with the photograph of the mysterious Rooney in his pocket-book. Carne had spent the afternoon with a fashionable party at Hurlingham, and it was not until he returned to his house that he received the telegram he had instructed his valet to send him. It was short and to the point. Friends arrived. Reach Euston 9 o'clock. The station clocks wanted 10 minutes of the hour when the hansom containing a certain ascetic-looking curate drove into the yard. The clergyman paid his fare, and having inquired the platform upon which the Liverpool express would arrive, strolled leisurely in that direction. He would have been a clever man who would have recognised in this unsophisticated individual either deformed Simon Carne of Park Lane or the famous detective of Belverton Street. Punctual almost to the moment, the train put in an appearance and drew up beside the platform. A moment later the curate was engulfed in a sea of passengers. A bystander, had he been sufficiently observant to notice such a thing, would have been struck by the eager way in which he looked about him, and also by the way in which his manner changed directly he went forward to greet the person he was expecting. To all appearances they were both curates, but their social positions must have been widely different, if their behaviour to each other could have been taken as any criterion. The new arrival, having greeted his friend, turned to 2 gentlemen standing beside him, and after thanking them for their company during the journey, wished them a pleasant holiday in England, and bade them good-bye. Then, turning to his friend again, he led him along the platform towards the cab rank. During the time Belton had been speaking to the 2 men just referred to, Carne had been studying their faces attentively. One, the taller of the pair, if his red hair and watery blue eyes went for anything, was evidently Maguire. The other was Rooney, the man of the photograph. Both were big burly fellows, and Carne felt that if it ever came to a fight they would be just the sort of men to offer a determined resistance. Arm in arm the curates followed the Americans towards the cab rank. Reaching it, the latter called up a vehicle, placed the bags they carried upon the roof, and took their places inside. The driver had evidently received his instructions, for he drove off without delay. Carne at once called up another cab, into which Belton sprang without ceremony. Carne pointed to the cab just disappearing through the gates ahead. "Keep that hansom in sight, cabby," he said, "but whatever you do, don't pass it." "All right, sir," said the man, and immediately applied the whip to his horse. When they turned into Seymour Street, scarcely 20 yards separated the two vehicles, and in this order they proceeded across the Euston Road by way of Upper Woburn Place and Tavistock Square. The cab passed through Bloomsbury Square and turned down one of the thoroughfares leading therefrom, and made its way into a street flanked on either side by tall, gloomy-looking houses. Leaning over the apron, Carne gazed up at the corner house, on which he could just see the plate setting forth the name of the street. What he saw there told him all he wanted to know. They were in Bellamer Street, and it was plain to him that the man had determined to thrust themselves upon the hapless Mrs. Jeffreys. He immediately poked his umbrella through the shutter, and bade the cabman drive on to the next corner, and then pull up. As soon as the horse came to a standstill, Carne jumped out, and bidding his companion drive home, crossed the street and made his way back until he arrived at a spot exactly opposite the house entered by the two men. His supposition that they intended to domicile themselves there was borne out by the fact that they had taken their luggage inside, and had dismissed their cab. There had been lights in 2 of the windows when the cab had passed. Now a third was added, and this he set down as emanating from the room allotted to the new arrivals. For upwards of an hour and a half Carne remained standing in the shadow of the opposite houses, watching the Jeffreys' residence. The lights in the lower room had by this time disappeared, and within 10 minutes that on the first floor followed suit. Being convinced in his own mind that the inmates were safely settled for the night, he left the scene of his vigil, and walking to the corner of the street, hailed a hansom and was driven home. On reaching No. 1 Belverton Street, he found a letter lying on the hall table, addressed to Klimo. It was in a woman's handwriting, and it did not take him long to guess that it was from Mrs. Jeffreys. He opened it and read as follows: Bellamer Street, Thursday evening. Dear Mr. Klimo, I am sending this to you to tell you that my worst suspicions have been realized. The 2 men whose coming I so dreaded have arrived, and have taken up their abode with us. For my father's sake I dare not turn them out, and tonight I have heard from my husband to say that he will be home on Saturday next. What is to be done? If something does not happen soon, they will commence their dastardly business in England, and then God help us all. My only hope is in him and you. Yours ever gratefully, Eileen Jeffreys. Carne folded up the letter with a grave face, and then let himself into Porchester House, and went to bed to think out his plan of action. Next morning he was up betimes, and by the breakfast hour had made up his mind as to what he was going to do. He had also written and dispatched a note to the girl who was depending so much upon him. In it he told her to come and see him without fail that morning. His meal finished, he went to his dressing room and attired himself in Klimo's clothes, and shortly after 10 o'clock entered the detective's house. Half an hour later Mrs. Jeffreys was ushered into his presence. As he greeted her he noticed that she looked pale and wan. It was evident she had spent a sleepless night. "Sit down," he said, "and tell me what has happened since last I saw you." "The most terrible thing of all has happened," she answered. "As I told you in my note, the men have reached England, and are now living in our house. You can imagine what a shock their arrival was to me. I did not know what to do. For my father's sake I could not refuse them admittance, and yet I knew that I had no right to take them in during my husband's absence. Be that as it may, they are there now, and tomorrow night George returns. If he discovers their identity and suspects their errand, he will hand them over to the police without a second thought, and then we shall be disgraced for ever. Oh, Mr. Klimo, you promised to help me. Can you not do so? Heaven knows how badly I need your aid." "You shall have it. Now listen to my instructions. You will go home and watch these men. During the afternoon they will probably go out, and the instant they do so, you must admit 3 of my servants and place them in some room where their presence will not be suspected by our enemies. A friend, who will hand you my card,
will call later on, and as he will take command, you must do your best to help him in every possible way." "You need have no fear of my not doing that," she said, "and I will be grateful to you till my dying day." "Well, we'll see. Now, goodbye." After she had left him, Klimo returned to Portchester House and sent for Belton. He was out, it appeared, but within half an hour he returned and entered his master's presence. "Have you discovered the bank?" asked Carne. "Yes, sir, I have," said Belton, "but not till I was walked off my legs. The men are as suspicious as wild rabbits, and they dodged and played about so that I began to think they'd get away from me altogether. The bank is the United Kingdom, Oxford Street branch." "That's right. Now what about the uniforms?" "They're quite ready, sir. Helmets, tunics, belts and trousers complete." "Well, then, have them packed, as I told you yesterday, and ready to proceed to Bellamer Street with the men the instant we get the information that the folk we are after have stepped outside the house door." "Very good, sir. And as to yourself?" "I shall join you at the house at 10 o'clock or thereabouts. We must, if possible, catch them at their supper." London was half through its pleasures that night when a tall, military-looking man, muffled in a large cloak, stepped into a hansom outside Portchester House, Park Lane, and drove off in the direction of Oxford Street. Though the business which was taking him out would have presented sufficient dangers to have deterred many men who consider themselves not wanting in pluck, it did not in the least oppress Simon Carne. On the contrary, it seemed to afford him no small amount of satisfaction. He whistled a tune to himself as he drove along the lamplit thoroughfares, and smiled as sweetly as a lover thinking of his mistress, when he reviewed the plot he had so cunningly contrived. He felt a glow of virtue as he remembered that he was undertaking the business in order to promote another's happiness, but at the same time reflected that, if fate were willing to pay him £50,000 for his generosity, well, it was so much the better for him. Reaching Moody's library, his coachman drove by the way of Hart Street into Bloomsbury Square, and later on turned into Bellamer Street. At the corner he stopped his driver and gave him some instructions in a low voice. Having done so, he walked along the pavement as far as number 14, where he came to a standstill. As on the last occasion that he had surveyed the house, there were lights in 3 of the windows, and from this illumination he argued that his men were at home. Without hesitation he went up the steps and rang the bell. Before he could have counted 50, it was opened by Mrs. Jeffreys herself, who looked suspiciously at the person she saw before her. It was evident that in the tall, well-made man with iron-grey moustache and dark hair, she did not recognise her elderly acquaintance, Klimo the detective. "Are you Mrs. Jeffreys?" asked the newcomer in a low voice. "I am," she answered. "Pray, what can I do for you?" "I was told by a friend to give you this card." He thereupon handed to her a card on which was written the one word, Klimo. She glanced at it, and as if that magic name were sufficient to settle every doubt, beckoned to him to follow her. Having softly closed the door, she led him down the passage until she arrived at a door on her right hand. This she opened and signed to him to enter. It was a room that was half office, half library. "I am to understand that you come from Mr. Klimo?" she said, trembling under the intensity of her emotion. "What am I to do?" "First be as calm as you can. Then tell me where the men are with whom I have to deal." "They are having their supper in the dining room. They went out soon after luncheon and only returned an hour ago." "Very good. Now, if you will conduct me upstairs, I shall be glad to see if your father is well enough to sign a document I have brought with me. Nothing can be done until I have arranged that." "If you will come with me, I will take you to him, but we must go quietly, for the men are so suspicious that they send for me to know the meaning of every sound. I was dreadfully afraid your ring would bring them out into the hall." Leading the way up the stairs, she conducted him to a room on the first floor, the door of which she opened carefully. On entering, Carne found himself in a well-furnished bedroom. A bed stood in the centre of the room, and on this lay a man. In the dim light, for the gas was turned down till it showed scarcely a glimmer, he looked more like a skeleton than a human being. A long white beard lay upon the coverlet. His hair was of the same colour, and the pallor of his skin more than matched both. That he was conscious was shown by the question he addressed to his daughter as they entered. "What is it, Eileen?"
he asked faintly.
"Who is this gentleman, and why does he come to see me?"
"He is a friend, father," she answered. "One who has come to save us from these wicked men."
"God bless you, sir,"
said the invalid, and as he spoke he made as if he would shake him by the hand. Carn, however, checked him.
"Do not move or speak," he said, "but try and pull yourself together sufficiently to sign this paper." "What is the document?" "It is something without which I can take no sort of action. My instructions are to do nothing until you have signed it. You need not be afraid. It will not hurt you. Come, sir, there is no time to be wasted. If these rascals are to be got out of England, our scheme must be carried out tonight." "To do that I will sign anything. I trust your honour for its contents. Give me pen and ink."
His daughter supported him in her arms, while Carn dipped a pen in the bottle of ink he had brought with him, and placed it in the tremulous fingers. Then, the paper being supported on a book, the old man laboriously traced his signature at the place indicated. When he had done so, he fell back upon the pillow, completely exhausted. Carn blotted it carefully, then folded the paper up, placed it in his pocket, and announced himself ready for the work. The clock upon the mantelpiece showed him that it was 11:15, so that if he intended to act that night, he knew he must do so quickly. Bidding the invalid rest happy in the knowledge that his safety was assured, he beckoned the daughter to him. "Go downstairs," he said in a whisper, "and make sure that the men are still in the dining room." She did as he ordered her, and in a few moments returned with the information that they had finished their supper and had announced their intention of going to bed. "In that case we must hurry," said Carn. "Where are my men concealed?" "In the room at the end of the passage," was the girl's reply. "I will go to them. In the meantime you must return to the study downstairs, where we will join you in 5 minutes' time. Just before we enter the room in which they are sitting, one of my men will ring the front door bell. You must endeavour to make the fellows inside believe that you are trying to prevent us gaining admittance. We shall arrest you, and then deal with them. Do you understand?" "Perfectly." She slipped away, and Carn hastened to the room at the end of the passage. He scratched with his fingernail upon the door, and a second later it was opened by a sergeant of police. On stepping inside, he found 2 constables and an inspector awaiting him. "Is all prepared, Belton?" he inquired. "Quite prepared, sir." "Then come along, and step as softly as you can." As he spoke, he took from his pocket a couple of papers, and led the way along the corridor and down the stairs. With infinite care they made their way along the hall until they reached the dining room door, where Mrs. Jeffreys joined them. Then the street bell rang loudly, and the man who had opened the front door a couple of inches shut it with a bang. Without further hesitation, Carn called upon the woman to stand aside, while Belton threw open the dining room door. "I tell you, sir, you are mistaken," cried the terrified woman.
"I am the best judge of that,"
said Carn roughly, and then, turning to Belton, he added,
"Let one of your men take charge of this woman."
On hearing them enter, the 2 men they were in search of had risen from the chairs they had been occupying on either side of the fire, and stood side by side upon the hearthrug, staring at the intruders as if they did not know what to do.
"James Maguire and Patrick Wake Rooney,"
said Carn, approaching the 2 men and presenting the papers he held in his hand,
"I have here warrants, and arrest you both on a charge of being concerned in a Fenian plot against the well-being of Her Majesty's Government. I should advise you to submit quietly. The house is surrounded, constables are posted at all the doors, and there is not the slightest chance of escape." The men seemed too thunderstruck to do anything, and submitted quietly to the process of handcuffing. When they had been secured, Carn turned to the inspector and said, "With regard to the other man who is ill upstairs, Septimus O'Grady, you had better post a man at his door."
"Very good, sir."
Then, turning to Messrs. Maguire and Rooney, he said, "I am authorised by Her Majesty's Government to offer you your choice between arrest and appearance at Bow Street, or immediate return to America. Which do you choose? I need not tell you that we have proof enough in our hands to hang the pair of you if necessary. You had better make up your minds as quickly as possible, for I have no time to waste." The men stared at him in supreme astonishment.
"You'll not prosecute us?"
"My instructions are, in the event of your choosing the latter alternative,
to see that you leave the country at once. In fact, I shall conduct you to Kingstown myself tonight, and place you aboard the mail boat there." "Well, so far as I can see, it's Hobson's choice," said Maguire. "I'll pay you the compliment of saying that you're smarter than I thought you'd be. How did you come to know we were in England?" "Because your departure from America was cabled to us more than a week ago. You have been shadowed ever since you set foot ashore. Now passages have been booked for you on board the outgoing boat, and you will sail in her. First, however, it will be necessary for you to sign this paper, pledging yourselves never to set foot in England again." "And supposing we do not sign it?" "In that case I shall take you both to Bow Street forthwith, and you will come before the magistrates in the morning. You know what that will mean." For some moments they remained silent. Then Maguire said sullenly, "Bedad, sir, since there's nothing else for it, I consent." "And so do I," said Rooney. "Where's the paper?" Carne handed them a formidable-looking document, and they read it in turn with ostentatious care. As soon as they had professed themselves willing to append their signatures to it, the sham detective took it to a writing table at the other end of the room, and then ordered them to be unmanacled, so that they could come up in turn and sign. Had they been less agitated, it is just possible they would have noticed that 2 sheets of blotting paper covered the context, and that only a small space on the paper, which was of a bluish-grey tint, was left uncovered. Then, placing them in charge of the police officials, Carne left the room and went upstairs to examine their baggage. Evidently he discovered there what he wanted to know, for when he returned to the room his face was radiant. Half an hour later they had left the house in separate cabs. Rooney was accompanied by Belton and one of his subordinates, now in plain clothes, while Carne and another took charge of Maguire. At Euston they found special carriages awaiting them, and the same procedure was adopted in Ireland. The journey to Queenstown proved entirely uneventful. Not for one moment did the 2 men suspect the trick that was being played upon them. Nevertheless, it was with ill-conceived feelings of satisfaction that Carne and Belton bade them farewell upon the deck of the outward-bound steamer. "Goodbye," said Maguire, as their captors prepared to pass over the side again. "And good luck to you. I'll wish you that, for you've treated us well, though it's a scurvy trick you've played us in turning us out of England like this. First, however, one question. What about O'Grady?" "The same course will be pursued with him as soon as he is able to move," answered the other. "I can't say more." "A word in your ear first," said Rooney. He leant towards Carne. "The girl's a good one," he said, "and you may do what you can for her, for she knows naught of our business." "I'll remember that, if ever the chance arises," said Carne. "Now, goodbye." "Goodbye." On the Wednesday morning following, an elderly gentleman, dressed in rather an antiquated fashion, but boasting an appearance of great respectability, drove up in a brougham to the branch of the United Kingdom Bank in Oxford Street, and presented a cheque for no less a sum than £45,000, signed with the names of Septimus O'Grady, James Maguire, and Patrick Rooney, and bearing the date of the preceding Friday. The cheque was in perfect order, and in spite of the largeness of the amount, it was cashed without hesitation. That afternoon Klimo received a visit from Mrs. Jeffreys. She came to express her gratitude for his help, and to ask the extent of her debt. "You owe me nothing but your gratitude. I will not take a halfpenny, and I am quite well enough rewarded now," said Klimo with a smile. When she had gone he took out his pocket book and consulted it. £45,000, he said with a chuckle. "Yes, that is good. I did not take her money, but I have been rewarded in another way." Then he went into Porchester House and dressed for the garden party at Marlborough House, to which he had been invited. End of section 8.